Hi everybody, welcome to Webisode number 2. As you can see, we've changed locations in my house. Now we have these curtains behind me. A fun side note would be, what do you think about these curtains? Do they look nice? Are they a little too much? I got my Milligan coffee. All right. On that note, let's begin talking about Frankenstein. This is only the first section that we're going to discuss, so if you could read the first volume before you listen to this, that would be probably the best course of action, and finish it before we talk next time. This novel began rather infamously, in 1816. Mary Shelley took a trip to Switzerland with her husband Percy Shelley, who his name you will probably recognize, a very famous romantic poet. They were not yet married, actually, at the time, but they were romantically involved. They took a trip with their physician and a couple of other friends, and they were quite bored at the time of this writing, so they decided to sit around in a circle all together and tell each other terrifying stories, just to pass the time. What was born of this circle meeting was the seeds of what would become Frankenstein. Also interesting to note, their physician, Polidori, would go on to write one of the first vampire tales in all of literature as a result. Not a very good tale, but still, the lore that we carry with us, the Frankensteins and Draculas that are still part of our Halloween culture every year, these were born of this one meeting in Switzerland. Interesting also to note here that, two interesting things to note. Percy Shelley gets a lot of credit for editing Mary's manuscript. For better or worse, Mary Shelley seemed to have received some help from her great literary husband in writing this. How much help is still a subject for debate. Another interesting note is Mary was very pregnant and very unmarried when she began writing this. So I think it's kind of interesting when we start thinking about Victor's creation, his sense of guilt, his sense of creating a monstrosity, is somewhat interesting when it's paralleled with Mary's impending birth and her worries about giving birth out of wedlock. So that's one interesting biographical note that maybe you could do something interesting with. All right, there are two opening lines at the beginning of the novel that I want to draw our attention to. The first one is the more common one, and probably one you're already familiar with: Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. Very clearly an interesting but not unexpected connection to Victor's desire to steal the knowledge to transcend death, to create something he's not supposed to create, to overstep the bounds of what human beings should or should not be able to do. So Prometheus, a natural connection that does not require much explanation. Other places in mythology, Icarus, who creates his wings to go up closer and closer to the sun and then come plummeting back down because he goes too high. That's another excellent example. But the more interesting line that I want to discuss here is from Paradise Lost, Milton's famous Paradise Lost, and the line is spoken by Adam after the fall in Paradise Lost. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me, man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? So, what I do want us to keep in the back of our mind as we're reading Frankenstein, if you've read Paradise Lost, or if you're familiar with Paradise Lost, the story of man's fall and the issues of man's creation and man's temptation later on, this allegory is all the way through Frankenstein. We need to unpack it, tease it out a little bit. So if you've read Paradise Lost, look for clues that connect this tale to Paradise Lost. And I think you'll be justly rewarded. And I'll come back to that next time and maybe try to tie some of those things together. All right, so with that being said, I want to begin at the beginning. What is important in the Gothic, as we've discussed previously, is the feeling of the physical sensation of fear, the creation of tingling sensations and things like this. It's a very physical genre. So I want to read just a little section on page 37 and see if we can understand where that's happening here. It's all the way through. We ascended into my room, and the servant presently brought breakfast, but I was unable to contain myself. It was not joy only that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle with excess of sensitiveness, and my pulse beat rapidly. I was unable to remain for a single instant in the same place. I jumped over the chairs, clapped my hands, and laughed aloud. He saw a wildness in my eyes for which he could not account, and my loud, unrestrained, heartless laughter frightened and astonished him. And that's just one example of countless. This novel, and again we see connections to Percy Shelley, whose poetry is very much based in the same kind of emotional gravitas. We see this weight heavily in Frankenstein. The influence is there all the way through, and every moment there seems to be a heart racing, sweat running down their face, the sensation of the tingling sensation, or the sensation that something is going to come out at any moment. Those things appear time and time again. So again, staples of the Gothic genre. The other thing I want to talk about here is the mixture of science and literature, fantasy. You will note that Victor initially is drawn into science, into the art of making monsters, through a deep love of literature, and through a science that is not exactly what we in the 21st century would deem scientific. His science is alchemy, magic. So I think it's interesting to think about the fact that science here is not so much based on rational calculation and these sorts of things, but actually it's based more on the imagination. Too often we maybe separate science and literature, or science and the arts, as being two separate things. Frankenstein asks us to combine the two together and see that great science, or amazing, astounding science, is typically deeply wedded to a strong imagination, an ability to create fantasy, to create sensations in audience. So, interesting ties that I think we could continue to follow all the way through, the tie of science and literature. Okay. As we discussed a moment ago, and the first real sign here of the connection to Adam and Eve and man's fall is Justine, not strangely named, a parallel to Justice. As you'll remember, Justine is wrongly accused of murder, and Victor sits through the trial knowing that his creature did the deed, but doesn't really speak up. So this is probably a moment which you are sitting there a little bit frustrated with Victor, recognizing that he is somewhat of a coward. Justine is ultimately found guilty of these crimes. But I think what's even more interesting than the fact that Victor lets his guilt eat away at him, and this is something that will haunt him moving forward, even more interesting than this is the response by Victor and his future spouse, fiancée, Elizabeth, that they cling desperately to Justine's innocence. And her innocence seems to play a really prominent role in the opening pages of Frankenstein. They desperately, desperately, desperately want her to be innocent of these crimes. Elizabeth says, I don't know if I can take it. I don't know if my heart can handle it if it turns up that she was not actually innocent. Victor, immediately afterwards, after the trial, is brought to think about his childhood. And Victor is an incredibly sheltered and, you might say, spoiled child. His parents really doted upon him. So he ends up sitting and ruminating back to his childhood, which he connects to a time of great innocence in his life. I feel pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of my childhood before misfortune had tainted my mind. Now, what is innocent? Why is innocence so important here? Why do we dwell for so long in this novel, which is really not about Justine, on the trial of Justine? Well, this, I think, we see the connection back to the Garden of Eden, back to a time before the fall. Clearly, this novel is reenacting the fall, and the characters are longing to go back to a time before Victor overstepped his bounds, before science created the creature that was unleashed, before, I think even before before the creature was created, they want to be childlike and innocent again. And there's something about this world that Frankenstein and Elizabeth live in that is not innocent, that has been tainted somehow. And so they're wrestling with a way to regain that sense of innocence. But ultimately, inevitably, Justine is imprisoned and found guilty, and innocence is lost. Paradise is lost. Okay, so interesting beginning to this novel that I think is worth taking a moment to talk about. You might be asking yourself, what is the frame story here? That is, why does Walton, his expedition to the North Pole and creating a passageway here, what's that story about? Why do we need him to be listening to Frankenstein tell the story? Why not just begin the novel with Frankenstein himself telling the account of his adventures with his creature? Why do we need Walton? And I think that's one of the more interesting parts of this novel and one of the more overlooked parts. What is Walton's function here? So, at the beginning, on page 10, I have, and this is in a letter to Margaret, I have one want which I have never yet been able to satisfy, and the absence of the object of which I now feel is a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. I shall commit my thoughts to paper, it is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man. And, further on page 16 and 17, on 16, One day I mentioned to him the desire I had always felt of finding a friend who might sympathize with me. And then, on page 17, the bottom, this manuscript will doubtless afford you, Margaret, the greatest pleasure. But to me, who know him, and who hear it from his own lips, with what interest and sympathy shall I read it in some future day? So, here's where I think there is meditation going on about the inability for human beings, the estrangement between human beings to communicate their feelings to one another. Walton, desperately more than anything, here he is struggling to find this passage and struggling to better man and do something that no man has done before. But what is his single greatest desire? The company of a man. This manuscript will not satisfy. What I really desire is friendship. And here, when he's talking to Margaret, I hope this manuscript can bring you some pleasure, but I know it won't really do that. I know that this medium is a poor one when it comes to expressing feelings. And so here, I think, opens the discussion of the further discussion of literature and art, and how does it connect human beings to one another. Going back again to the kind of biblical allegory that's going on, these people are estranged from each other and struggling to find a way to reconnect, to come back to a time before the Tower of Babel. And that's maybe a key point in the timeline. There is pre-Babel, the innocence of childhood, and then there is the post-Babel territory that they're occupied in here. And all they have is this writing that can't quite capture it, that can't quite pass on or supplement or replace the human love for one another that came before. But here they are struggling to in their fallen state. Victor himself is going to dabble in this. He is, as we know, a strong student of literature and language. And in fact, at key moments of his life, he returns to the study of literature and language, and it does things to heal him. On page 43, we passed a fortnight, this is he and Clerval, we passed a fortnight in these perambulations. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed. So, here he is studying Greek and Latin, reading great poetry. The problem is, as Walton establishes early on, as healing as literature can be for these characters, as healing as literature can provide the kind of support, the kind of happiness that they've been looking for, he knows that it will fall short. On page 8, this is Walton. I also became a poet, and for 1 year lived in a paradise of my own creation. Again, a paradise. I imagined that I also might obtain a niche in the temple where the names of Homer and Shakespeare are consecrated. You are well acquainted with my failure. So, literature is not enough. And here is the struggle of Victor and of Walton, and this is what connects them. They deeply are looking for something, but the inability of these manuscripts, the inability of literature and words and language to capture what they're missing is very pronounced. And this, I think, says something about their fallen state, their current nature, and this is the state of man. Okay, so the final point that I want to make in this particular webisode is the lack of contentment that Walton and Victor feel. that drives them to these extremes, that drives them to commit these kinds of crimes against humanity. In these moments that drive them here, we see how deeply dissatisfied they really are. All right, so let's look at page 31. This is Victor's beginning his tale, and he occasionally will pause to have a kind of didactic teacher moment. And he says, "Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow." So, during this time, man is struggling to become master of many things. Master over nature, master over the entire globe, master over his fellow man. And in these strong attempts and efforts at mastery, this is what leads to excess and ruin. As we move forward, we will see the kind of cursed, tragic route that fallen Victor must pursue. But he knows they're trying to re-enter the garden. They're trying to go to a time before the Tower of Babel. They're trying to enter a state of bliss and perfect contentment. They're trying with all their might. That's what breeds and creates the creature in the first place. The problem is, this doesn't seem possible. It seems like a futile effort. And so Victor says, find contentment in your fallen state. This is not the place, nor do you have the ability to regain perfect Edenic qualities in your life. All right. In closing, think about Frankenstein as not Frankenstein, the bolts in the neck creature that is put together from the corpses of various criminals. Frankenstein meaning Victor Frankenstein, the creator of sorts. Think about him as an artist, and we already mentioned the parallels between Mary Shelley and Victor himself, as giving birth to the creature. How is that linked in some ways to giving birth to the story itself? Frankenstein is creating this narrative. What does it mean to create something grotesque? What does it mean to struggle to connect with fellow human beings through this very flawed medium of literature? So draw a connection between the author, and he's frequently called the author of the creature, Frankenstein, and Frankenstein, the author of the text that we are reading, the text that's in our hands. Literary creation, scientific creation, both of these things colliding and clashing in the search to transcend this limited state of mankind. All right, so enjoy the remaining parts of Frankenstein. I hope you get a great amount out of it. It's one of my favorites. There's lots to say, so I hope to hear from you on the discussion forum, other issues that you would like to raise. Enjoy Frankenstein. See you next time.